Back in April of this year, we started to plan out and plant an orchard between the common house and the native insect meadow. We devised berms that were more or less on slope and that could intercept water moving downhill. At first, we began putting in the main trees and shrubs to serve as anchor points within the different rows. We planted a number of fruiting trees like apples, plums, cherries, persimmons, and pears, for instance, but also interspersed the areas with shrubs like currants, gooseberries, honeyberries, blackberries, and more. Now, I didn't want to rush the planting, so I took some time to think about what other plants we'd enjoy planting in the guilds, which is a group of plants that act like a community, supporting one another through various ways like nutrient cycling and attracting beneficial insects. From May through October, I continued to round out the plantings in the orchard, including native edible perennial tuberous or bulbous plants like groundnut, meadow garlic, and wild hyacinth, and herbaceous medicinal perennials like bergamot, mountain mint, echinacea, wild quinine, and others. Planting the orchard over the course of 6 months as opposed to all at once really gave me the space to be more thoughtful in the approach, so I decided to create a framework and jot down what I felt was important to us and what services each plant was providing within the orchard, which I'll share a little with you now. All right, guys, so we are out in the orchard. You may hear some ripping and roaring behind me because some of the neighbors are riding their UTVs around, but I think you'll be able to hear me just fine. You'll just have to bear with that. But we're out here in the orchard, and I recently just laid out some new cardboard and like painter's paper, basically. I ran out of cardboard and someone had the excellent suggestion of doing painter's paper. I bought too thin of a painter's paper and the weeds came right up, but I found a thicker version, and they seem to be holding their own at least for the rest of this year. Now, I don't think you'll see much here in the orchard, so I'm just gonna kind of take you through some of the plants that we planted, even though it's fall and some of them have lost their leaves already, but some real standouts. And also what I want to accomplish today is just like how we started to think about like orchard guilds. So you often hear about like permaculture guilds and planting in and around plants, and basically a guild is like a collection of plants that could coexist and work with one another. So you might have something that's like a nitrogen fixer, for instance, so that fixes nitrogen, helps fix nitrogen within the soil, and the plant could actually use that because nitrogen is usually one of the most important macronutrients for plants. Then you might have something that repels certain pesky insects, and that might be a plant that attracts beneficial insects, or it might be a plant like a mint, for instance, that will deter other wildlife like, say, deer, which we've had some issues with deer browse, which I'll talk briefly about. But basically, the way that we thought about this orchard, and if you go back to one of our initial videos, is that there's not a lot of straight lines that we're doing on our land, but this was an area that we decided that we'd do straight lines. And we would basically mow and manage between here, which is actually primarily clover. And that's something that it's a white clover, white Dutch clover, and that's what most of this area is. And so it's always a buzz with some generalist pollinators here. But I also find clover to be relatively pushy. It kind of pushes itself into the garden beds, and very difficult to kind of like get out. I mean, a lot of people like the clover because it brings in that pollinator and it actually provides a nice ground cover. And of course, clover is just doing its job of being a ground cover. It is an excellent nitrogen fixer, so some people like to cut it back, but I find that it could be quite challenging. You could see that we're using this Fragaria, which is strawberry. This is our native strawberry. Look at these stolons that they're just sticking out. Like, we started with like basically a few. I had to take these out of another garden bed because we planted it up differently, and I decided to transplant these. These don't give any kind of big fruits. So this is kind of our like wild strawberry end, but I figured, these things, even if we're not collecting them, they could be actually great for wildlife. And then I started to plant some different herbs around. And so this is a great example of Tanacetum. This is feverfew. This is where some of our medicinals will go. And then we have these kind of dwarf to semi-dwarf trees. I do hope this one survives. I think this one is, so this is a sweet cherry. So a lot of our trees especially the apples, really got hit. So those of the Malus genus, first by the spongy moths early in the year. Then we had a pretty bad drought, although we were watering this quite heavily. And then we had a female deer that came in here that got through the exclusion fence. We actually found where they came in, and now we've kind of locked that up, but we accidentally locked the deer in here. And she fawned in here, and so we haven't gotten around to actually chasing them out, but they've definitely done a number on some of the trees. So it'll be very interesting in spring what actually pops up and what doesn't. But if I could just step back for a second, some of the, early in the year, we just had these trees that we put in, and I really wanted to take my time to think about, well, how can I plant around them? What will I plant around them? And I'll show you a little spreadsheet that I kind of put together, but I just wrote it down in my handy dandy book here so I could remember. But I basically created this like guild system on a point system, and I think anybody could actually do this if your brain works this way. So, oftentimes if you're looking at like permaculture guilds or whatever, you could see what other people have done before you, and I think that's really helpful. But I like the idea of like ranking what you think is important to you in your garden. And so I created this basically point system or rank system that I think anybody could really use. And I started to prioritize things that maybe other folks may not prioritize, and that's okay, because then you could actually give it different points. So for instance, if the plant was a New York native, a native species to the state of New York, which is where we're in, then I would give it 3 points. And if it was a US native, so maybe it wasn't native to New York, but it's native to Pennsylvania, or it might be native to Oregon or some other state, then I would give it 2 points. Now, if it was a New York native, I wouldn't say that it was US native. So even though it is within the US, that was like my decision that I wouldn't give it like 5 points, for instance, if it was a New York native and in the US. It was either or in this case. Then the rest I had was basically 1 point. So does it attract pollinators? Does it attract beneficial insects? Is it an insect host plant? That's maybe something that somebody doesn't care about, but considering that this orchard is butting up against our native insect meadow, which is, we picked a lot of species that we seeded in there that would be actually good host plants for insects. That was something that I deemed that I think would be important to us. Does it suppress weeds, right? So exactly just like the Fragaria, this could be a good weed suppressor because you could see how much it operates as a ground cover. Some folks might actually plant an annual here, like nasturtium, for instance. That's a really good ground cover. I found that some of the sweet potatoes that started to grow like little eyes, I stuffed those into the soil, and if the green shoots grow, and if you're not having them climb, those are excellent ground covers. We have a Prunus pumila variation depressa. That's a kind of a spreading ground cover. So there's quite a few plants in here that could be viewed as ground covers. They might take a slower time to grow. The plants under here are a type of ground cover as well, but I find that they're very slow growing. I have them under here because one of the growers said the voles actually really like to get into this, and a vole could actually get down under here, but I didn't want any rabbits or anything, so I just put these cloches over the top of them. And then providing biomass. So what that means is, like, does it get a lot of leafage? And can you actually cut that leaf and then just provide some biomass in the area? Because we kind of constantly have to, fill in and top this off with compost. So if you have this kind of good green manure, then it could provide a lot of like good biomass. And sometimes if it's very leafy, that could actually also be a very good ground cover. So for instance, like rhubarb is a great example. Those get huge leaves, and that could, shade the ground below, keep it cool, shade out any of the weeds or the grasses or the clovers that might want to try to grow in there. And of course, like it takes a while for rhubarb to establish, but once it's established, it could be a pretty honkin' plant, which is like very good. And we did plant some rhubarb in here. The other thing is, does it fertilize the soil? So that's a great example of like, do you want to keep clover or don't you want to keep clover? Because clover is a great, nitrogen fixer. And and actually you could cut it back and it fertilizes. Anything that could be kind of a green manure that you could cut and fertilize the soil, that's also very useful. Does it deter wildlife? So a great example right here in the corner. I started to plant like more alliums and mints. So clearly this is an allium. If I break this, it will have a slight smell, and some of them will smell stronger than others. This one actually doesn't smell as strong, but and I can't remember, like I planted so many different type of alliums, some of them native, and some of them native to the US, and some of them not native. And I like the idea of actually planting some of the native bulbs in here, because if they actually spread out into the field, I wouldn't be like upset by that. Not that I'm like a full-blown like native person. Like I do really like, I mean, there's so many like trees, like for instance, some of the cherries and apples, they're not native here, and I really enjoy those. So actually I planted quite a bit of alliums that are native. So Allium canadense and Cernuum, that's the nodding onion. And actually some other kind of cool bulbs, now that I'm on that topic. Camassia, which is native to the US, and it's basically a wild hyacinth. And then I also planted, I think this is our crocuses coming up. So this is Crocus sativus. I think we planted about 100 of those. Here's another one coming up, look at that. So we might be able to harvest these this year. This is the saffron crocus, which is super cool. They're really cute, purple flowers. They don't get very large, maybe 3 inches tall, 3 to 4 inches tall. Very low to the ground, and you could collect the little saffron. Obviously it takes a lot of effort, and it might not be worth an effort for you, but I decided that we would actually plant some bulbs in here along with the other bulbs. With the camassia, the hyacinth, and the other bulbs, we won't really be harvesting those until like summertime. So we'll have to wait on those. But yeah, so as I was saying before, deterring wildlife, I mean, clearly when these die back in the winter, they're not going to deter any kind of wildlife. But in the spring and summer, as these tend to billow out, then maybe they could provide some type of barrier for rodents or deer, for example. Then here's a more controversial one, dynamic accumulator. And there's been a lot more research into this area, and admittedly I want to do a bit more research into this, but there's this discussion of that some plants are able to actually bring up nutrients from the deeper layers of the soil and then establish some of those nutrients up above, especially when you actually cut the leaves back. Comfrey is a really great example that folks often talk about, but I think the research is a little wavy. it's a little wavering about that. And I've actually seen a really amazing soil book about the root structures of comfrey, and they actually don't go down as deep as one would think, even compared to like a grass, for instance. You have some grasses that are going down like 18 feet. So then you begin to question, well, would they be a dynamic accumulator? So I think that was, I kind of put it in there just for fair measure because it's often included when you're thinking about permaculture guilds. And then of course, if it's edible and or medicinal. Not all the things are edible in here. Some of them might actually just provide like pollination sources, and that could be good enough. So basically I did a score. You could get, I think, at the maximum 13 points. And then there's 11 categories. There's actually really 12 because is it a New York native or US native? But basically those are interchangeable. So it's really 11 categories. And the highest score you could get is 143. So basically I was running just a series of plants, kind of the things that I'd like to actually see in here, what I think would actually be effective. And just looking at them, like how many points do they score? You could arguably say, well, I only want things that will go above 30 points. And so this really, I kind of abandoned this like maybe a third of the way through because I only did this for maybe 30 plants, and we have maybe close to 100 different kinds of plants in here. But it got to the point where I think it just gave me a framework to kind of think about it and to think about, well, am I actually putting something that's nitrogen fixing nearby? Am I putting something that will deter deer? Am I putting in something that's actually medicinal? Because I just basically wanted to hit those categories in all of the orchard. So let's just kind of go through and I'll talk through some of these things about what we've planted. This one's a nice tree here. So this is our northern spy. And oftentimes with apples, they're not self-fertile. So you need to actually get another apple that it could cross-pollinate with. So we actually went a little heavy on the apples because, well, you know, in order to get fruit on those trees, you actually need to cross-pollinate. So we have a bit more apples, and you know, Sandra, you really like Fuji apples, so we got a few different types of Fujis. And the Northern Spy happens to be a very delicious apple that's also a great pie apple. So my dad's girlfriend oftentimes will make us an apple pie. And I'm not a big pie person, but her apple pie is absolutely delicious, and she loves to use Northern Spy. And of course, we've heard that as well, like when we did a tour with, what's the apple?
Little Tree Orchard.
Which one?
Little Tree Orchard.
Little Tree Orchards, that's right. Little Tree Orchards, they also mentioned the Northern Spy. This one's an interesting one. I have never grown this before. You should smell this. Smell that plant. Very, very fragrant, very perfumey actually. So this is not a native plant. It's called Peruvian black mint. So I think a lot of folks from Central and maybe South America might actually know this plant. I think it's used in making a popular dish called ocopa. And even though it's called Peruvian black mint, you could feel the stem. It doesn't have a square stem. It is actually in the Asteraceae family. So it has these little flowers up top. And I often quite see a lot of pollinators on this, ranging from like flies to bees. And it is huge. I mean, it gets to be 6 feet tall. You could see I'm almost 6 feet tall. And this plant is about my size. So I was impressed. I didn't realize how big it actually got, but I knew that it was really fragrant and it would probably deter deer. And you could see it might do it because it's right up against this Aztec apple. And this apple does not seem like it got eaten. I mean, it has quite a bit of green leaves. So this might be something that is actually working with this plant. So yeah, so you could see that I have this, you know, medicinal edible herb that, you know, I guess this is often used in making a paste. So in the dish ocopa, which is more like a potato dish, but they use walnuts and other kinds of things, and they put it in here, and it's like kind of this green paste that you could actually get bottled up or whatever. So we'll have to experiment with that. But I also think it's a great plant. It's a good pollinator. It's medicinal. It's edible. And it seems to deter wildlife because it has that scent. And then you could see around here, we planted more strawberries. I mean, I think we planted 400 or 500 different strawberries and many, many different varieties. So this will actually be one of the ground covers. We planted some camassia and alliums around here as well. So that will also deter wildlife, but is also edible. So that's coming up. This one looks like it's at the end, and funiculum. This is fennel. Smells so good. So it has like a little bit of an anisey scent, and you could collect the seeds. You could also use the seeds. It's a wonderful, gentle herb. It's often used with like in infants if they have like colic. So that's one that we grow, and I think it's really beautiful. It's an insect host plant. And then we have a type of mint here. I have this growing everywhere. It's in our meadow, it's in our herb garden. This is pycnanthemum, and we have different types of species of pycnanthemum. This is basically called mountain mint. And you can see that these are getting a little bedraggled, but look, this is the beauty of mint. It will spread like crazy, and it kind of spreads a bit more rhizomatously and will start to come outwards. But you can see all this new growth down here. So cutting this back, not a big deal. It doesn't mind being cut back. This, I think, is a persimmon. I can't quite remember, but I think it's a persimmon. It'll be very interesting to see if it comes back up. This is a rubus, it looks like. Yep, baby cakes blackberry, so that's a blackberry. Here's an example of some of those rhizomes coming out. See that? So it just kind of sticks out like arms or fingers and will start to spread. And I think once it starts to get into this area, I'm not quite sure what I'm gonna do with it. Do I let it grow and spread into this? I might just do that. Some little sunflower seeds coming up. I did not plant those. That's compliments of the chipmunk. This is an example of an apple tree that really got hit. I mean, look at, I don't know if this is gonna survive in the spring. I did put this over, but it might be too late with that. Some of these plants here that you can't really see, this might have been a Baptisia, which is Baptisia minor. So that's a US native, but it's a great kind of plant for pollinators, but also is a nitrogen fixer. So those are some plants that we thought were really important to plant in here, and they do provide some beautiful color. Oh, this is a honeyberry, so we planted a few of these in here. Obviously they're still doing okay, they just lost all their leaves. And these are some really interesting varieties of strawberries that we planted down here. Some of them get pink flowers, which are kind of cool. Some of them get yellow flowers, which is really neat. And then this right here, is this a pear? Yeah, Bosque pear. So this one's pretty substantial. And in my estimation, pears don't seem to be really affected by the deer very much. I don't know why. But, and then here you'll see some Monarda, which we did Bradburniana, we did punctata. These are some of the spent flower heads that have turned into seed heads. And I have to say, pollinators absolutely love this. I believe it's an insect host plant, and it's an incredible medicinal. Definitely some of my top in there. We'll just circle back to here really quickly because we're not gonna be able to highlight everything that I've grown, but I see something in bloom, which is exciting. You'll be able to see the saffron crocus here. Look at this. Look at the little, see these little red parts on here? That is your saffron. Look at that. Incredible. I like to put it in butternut soup. But you could imagine having to harvest that. It's crazy. I've already harvested quite a bit of celeriac here. I have 2 left. This is one of our favorite vegetables. So this is celery root. It's probably one of those things that if you're not familiar with eating it, you probably pass right by it at the grocery store with all those like weird root vegetables. You might know the carrot, but maybe right next to it is the burdock root, celery root, you know, things that you'd pass by, but this is absolutely delicious. And this is basically our root cellar, right? This ground, this earth is our root cellar. So this doesn't mind some late frosts. And of course, you could cut these leaves and use them in making broth as well, especially if you're making soup. So again, one of our favorite vegetables, and we make some of our favorite dishes out of this as well. So I think I just planted 5 and we have 2 left. And I think next year, whether we plant them here or in another part of our garden, we'll probably plant a lot more of these. I do really like them enough to plant some more. Let's head over here. This part gets really wet. So you'll see sometimes the water hits right here, which is not a bad thing, and it just like soaks into here and then eventually gets into this area. Well, we have some interesting plants. This I have to take off the stake pretty soon. This is called a che plant. So it gets like this, this set of berries around it that look very similar to a cornus, so a dogwood. So I have a male, and they are self-fertile, but they produce better fruit if there's a male. So I have a male planted here and 2 different types of females. This is another plant I'd like to increase lingonberries. We have different varieties, and there's not enough of these berries that we could harvest, so I'm gonna leave them on here for now. But we love this as a jam with our pancakes. So and in this kind of area, we've planted a lot more acidic plants. Our blueberries got hit a bit by some nibbling, but these lingonberries have done really well. So you'll see I planted a bunch. They get pretty low growing, so I think these could also be considered more of a ground cover, and we get some really nice berries on them this year, so that's pretty good. This is an interesting plant that also starting to leaf out again. This I was very impressed with because it is a native insect plant. It's called New Jersey tea or red stem. Incredible medicinal. It gets only about 3 feet tall and spreads out, so it could also be a very high ground cover. Very nice. Some more mints and alliums. And yeah, this is Agastache. So I have this growing in the pollinator garden. Pollinators love it. Love. This one's the rose Agastache, which has a little essence of rose, but very good, very tasty. And I do believe that this is, yeah, Kinnikinnick. So this is Arctostaphylos uva ursi. So again, really cool, native, grows like these little berries on it, that it was a very important medicine for the Native Americans, and it also provides a really lovely ground cover. So this is, it gives you a sense of kind of what we're growing here in our orchard. Again, I can't cover all of it, but you'll see that we're trying to plant around and create these guilds, very loose guilds, but at least getting a framework to think about how we're doing it. So that is our orchard. If you've planned and planted out orchard guilds in your area, feel free to share them in the comments below and let us know what have worked the best for you and why. We love opening up the community conversation here in the comments and enjoy further instructive input from all of you. As always, we'll do updates as we go, but winter will be upon us soon, and I'm sure gardening will be winding down before you know it. Now, if you're enjoying these videos and find them useful, do us a favor and give them a thumbs up. And if you care to know when new videos release, tapping the subscribe and notifications bell will do the trick. Plus, that helps us grow the channel so we can produce more great content and also allows us to give back to the community. 10% of our Google AdSense revenue is reinvested back into people's projects in the area. And that is actually matched by our partners over at Espoma Organic, which is awesome because it doubles the impact. Thanks again for your support, and we'll see you in the next video.